Hello, welcome to the next week in our series looking at the book of Daniel and faith. So today we are covering Daniel 5. So if you haven't already, have a pause of the video and read Daniel chapter 5. It's the whole chapter, which is the writing on the wall. So have a read of that. So in this chapter, it takes us into this next stage, really, for Babylon. We don't find out about what happens to King Nebuchadnezzar. So if you watched last week's or read through last week's notes, it kind of ended after he'd had that time out in the wilderness, totally removed from power, from everything he knew. And then God just revealed himself to him and he got reinstated as king of Babylon. So that was where chapter 4 ended. And chapter 5 starts with this new king, King Belshazzar. And this is a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. And as we read the start of this chapter, it certainly struck me that it feels a little bit like same old, same old. It feels very similar to how King Nebuchadnezzar was, throwing this big banquet, inviting, I think it's over 1,000 nobles, it said, so that might have been plus with a +1 maybe. So you're talking at least 1,000 people at this banquet. And the really key thing here, I think, for us is to recognise that Belshazzar asks for the goblets to drink wine from, and the goblets he asks for are the ones that they took out of the temple in Jerusalem. And if you remember back at week 1, when we were looking at the start of Daniel 1, it actually unpacks for us there in one of the early verses that not only did they take people into exile, but they actually took things out of the temple and took them to take to Babylon. And it talks in there, in those verses, about things being taken out of God's temple to be put into the temple and the temples, because there was multiple ones, and the treasure houses that they had for the Babylonian gods and the gods that Nebuchadnezzar just decided they were going to worship. And if you want to know even more about the things in the temple and some of the other things that they might have taken and what kind of God's ideas and laws and rules were over making these items sacred, have a look in Exodus 30. And it unpacks in that chapter how these items were made to be sacred, were made to be set apart, were made to be holy and consecrated to God. And here we see Belshazzar coming in, taking over rule, showing people who he is, having a complete disregard for these items, just using them how he wants to. It's his way during this banquet to show people, look at me, I'm the ruler now, look at my power, look at my might, look at my wealth, look at what I've inherited and what I'm now going to do what I like with it. These were the goblets taken from the temple that Belshazzar was asking to be used, to now be used to drink wine from. And as these verses tell us, whilst they're worshipping other gods in Babylon. So some of this idea to us might feel a little bit foreign. We haven't really got a modern day equivalent of it. But let's just think what this is saying and what we can perhaps take from this of our own lives and kind of put some application on it. And it does make me think, what would the exiles have thought of this? They'd have known, those goblets, if they'd heard about this, or even the people back in Jerusalem had heard about this, they'd have known where those goblets came from. They'd have known their purpose. They'd have known how sacred and holy they were because of their use in worshipping God. What is it saying to them when Belshazzar is using them in this way, but also this lack of regard or disregard for God or disregard for what is holy? What is Belshazzar saying to God in this way? He's taking something that was set apart for God, using it for whatever he feels like. And it makes me do a little bit of a parallel, a little bit of a link here, that when we think back, when Jesus came, when Jesus died for us, it was so we could be seen as holy, as consecrated to God, as set apart for God, that actually Jesus made a way so that our sin wouldn't hold us back, wouldn't keep us separated from God, but he came so that we wouldn't be tainted in that way, but that we would be seen as precious, as holy, as beautiful, as children of God, as set apart for him, to worship him. And it's interesting, isn't it, that we can make choices over our own lives of, do we live in that set apart way? Those goblets Belshazzar used for something that wasn't what they were made for, that was really disregarding what their purpose was and disregarding God, who they were there to worship. And almost we can be like that ourselves, disregarding what God's given us, not stepping into all that God has for us, not worshipping God and holding him up and keeping him in that holy place that he is so worthy of, using things in our own lives that's more about us than it ever is about God and bringing him glory. It does make me think, what does God feel? What does God think when we act in a way that's disregarding him rather than giving him the worship, the glory that he deserves? So just a thought there really for us. But to move on with the story, God knows he's got to get Belshazzar's attention. How much sometimes does he need to do that with us? God needs to show him to live a different way, to be aware of what it means to live for God, to be humble before God, to give God the worship and honour that he is due. And this hand appears. Even though I've read this story many times over my life, I still can't quite get my head around what it must have been like for the people there to just see these fingers, this hand appear writing on the wall. It certainly got his attention, and probably everyone else in the room. And the hand write these words that are in Aramaic, and none of the king's advisors, wise men, can decipher the language or tell the king what it means. And then this queen of the palace remembers Daniel helping Nebuchadnezzar with similar things. And I find it interesting that still Daniel is referred to as Daniel, his Hebrew name, not by his given Babylonian name of Belteshazzar, but still as Daniel. So Daniel comes to the king. It's thought that he was about 80 years old at this time, so he'd been in exile a long time. And we see this encounter as he comes before the king. He is so courageous. He is so firm. Before he even translates a word of what is written, he speaks firmly and strongly to the king. He talks about not wanting man's promotion or man's wealth, which Belshazzar is offering him in return for interpreting what is written. Daniel really wants Belshazzar to see the error of his ways. And so Daniel, before interpreting, as I've said, gives this whole backstory of, you know what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. You know how Nebuchadnezzar wasn't living for God, how he was a proud man, how God had to humble him. And once he did, he worshipped God. He lived his life differently. He had a change of heart. But it almost seems like something's a bit different this time. Almost like God's saying, come on, you know what you should be doing here. You know it. I shouldn't have to tell you. And so we get these words from God. It almost seems like God knew perhaps Belshazzar wouldn't change his heart as a result of God telling him, speaking to him. It wouldn't alter his way of living. And so God gives him these words, mene, which implies counting, tekel, if I'm pronouncing it right, hopefully, which refers to weights, and parsin, which is separation or splitting. And so Daniel unpacks those three words and gives God's meaning of what that impact will be on Belshazzar, not just the meaning of the words, but what God's meaning is for him in his life, how it's going to impact his life. He gives that interpretation, and we hear God's judgment, and it's quite harsh, isn't it? It sounds harsh. He's been weighed up. His days have been numbered. The rule is going to be split, is going to be divided. And following the interpretation, we don't really hear what Belshazzar's response is. All we hear is that Daniel is given the reward anyway of being made this third highest ruler in the kingdom and everything that goes along with that, which he didn't really want. So he does that anyway. Is that an indication that he's not really heard Daniel? Because he's given him the man's wealth and position, which he never wanted in the first place. And that same night, Belshazzar is slain, and Darius the Mede takes over the kingdom and rule. End of the story. It's harsh, isn't it? There is no real chance or time that Belshazzar has to change his heart, to try a different way, to even really put into practice or implement or act upon, or whatever word you want to use, change his life off the back of this teaching that Daniel has given him, or interpretation that Daniel has given him. And something it does make me think of is how grateful and thankful I am that we don't have to live that way because of Jesus. Jesus gives us every chance and will continue to give us every chance, along with every person, to change their ways, to change our ways, to change my ways, to turn, to repent, to recognize who God is, to live my life differently as a result of who he is and my relationship with him and the love he wants to give me and show me and shower upon me. It makes me wonder, what did the other people that were there think? Did they hear the interpretation? Did they see the writing on the wall? Did it make them change their hearts? Did it make them change their ways and live differently in response to what Daniel spoke and what he said? It does make me think we don't often realise the idea of how we live, of the words we say, the impact that can have on other people, both good and bad. And something that I just want to encourage us with off the back of this story is to have the boldness of Daniel in speaking out God's truth, not just in our words, but boldness in how we live, boldness in our attitudes, boldness in how we are with people, boldness in a way that's going to help, not condemn, but a boldness that is going to show the love of Jesus, that's going to show people you have every chance to change. You have every chance to let Jesus impact your life and live not for yourself, but to live for him, to live with the love and the truth of God. And not only should our lives be impacted by that for others, but our lives should be like that because it needs to impact us. Our response to God's love for us should mean there's a heart change, should mean there's a change in how we are, in that all we have needs to be lived for God, lived for his glory, and live for his worship and honour that he's due. So be encouraged today. We have every chance. Every day is a new day to live our lives for Jesus, to live our lives as that representation of him for others, so God can impact not just our lives, but others as well. God bless.